Okay. So how do I manipulate this? Yes. Right. So so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is from the book, although I will frame it around the academic discourses, and I will have some slide about implications for ion theory and policy, which may not be in the book, but it is very important to take a look at the book to develop any ideas I can then further, rather than from the street. So you just do it. I have hands. Yeah, all right. Like this? Yeah, this is. Just no. Okay. So it's working. Yeah. How do I go back to the beginning? No. With the section. Can you just go forward one like back on that? Okay, it's okay. So this book is about world order. Today's lecture is actually to talk about the path and future of world, present and future of world order, drawing from this book. And you have a little article from the New York Times, which I hope you have read. Have you read it? Those of you read it will find it very easy. It's actually a 1,000 word summary of the whole book. I mean, okay. And I also gave an interview with PIR. So I'm hoping that you're right. People have read the New York Times article. You circulated, yeah. You circulated all the statement. Within that, there was the answer. And the interview with the international relations. It's a very good outlet. So the who were the published. They're very friendly towards students and so young faculty. But I always publish GIR, open download, and then there's no paywall. So you should personally read that and of 799 rupees. It's okay. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. That's what it, yeah. Uh, I'll do it. Go ahead. Okay. All right. So you should be able to get this book for 799. My publisher has an office in India, and they will be very happy to send it to you. Or you can just go to Gurgaon and buy the warehouse. I'm also giving a book talk at the India International Center on the 1st of August at 6 o'clock, which anybody is welcome. And that will be also about the book. And the book will be on sale there. So you can actually buy, and there will be probably a 20% discount on the 1st of August at 6 p.m. Right. So this is the British edition, and this is the American edition, and there is also an international edition which is sold in India. So how do I go? Go up, down, no, like this. Okay. So this is the international edition which is available in India. So you can see it's only a fraction of the actual cost. 799 like a cup of tea, right? These days. Uh, Starbucks probably charges you 7.99 for a cup of coffee. And this is 464 pages, 5,000 years of history, covering every single civilization from around 3000 BC to the present. No, all the regions. So there is Africa, there is the Americas, pre-Columbian Americas, Islam, China, India, Europe, the United States. The whole world is covered, and that's why it's a good value. And in some ways, it's a teaching tool because a lot of this, what I wrote here, came out of. First of all, actually, the origins of actual text was a Ghian lecture I gave at Jamia Millia Islamia in 2016, and we recorded that conversation for me only, professionally, and then we transcribed it with the help of the department Professor Rashmi Raiswami, a good, very very capable person, and then so he sent it back to me, and I used that as a text. I build on, kept teaching, and mostly to undergraduates, first year students. but sometimes to higher level, honors level, and also master's level, but mostly undergraduates. And then it became a text. It became much more expansive. The original lectures are only focusing on China, India, Europe, Islam, United States, and the global South, but the expanded edition covers every region: Africa, Latin America, South Pacific, and the like. So it's a history of world order, and it will be a good value at a very cheap price. It's creating a lot of controversy. Okay. Um, the right wing people don't like it, and the liberal people love it, but academics and students like it. So that's the most important, my audience for that. Right. So these are the five key arguments in the book. Uh, so this is basically in a way to summarize the 464 pages. The first argument is probably the most important one. So I will go through them very quickly, but you would have this in the writings we circulated. The world order, broadly defined as ensuring stability and dispelling chaos. So chaos versus order. That's the traditional. Every civilization defines order as maintaining stability and dispelling the forces of chaos that comes from Egyptian word Isfat, the Pharaonic language word Mat versus Isfat. 3,000 years ago, that's what Pharaoh Mot, the founder of Egyptian first dynasty, uh, basically after conquering, it came from Upper Egypt, from the what is Sudan, Egypt valley. It conquered Lower Egypt, going towards Alexandria, unified Egypt, and then put a plaque called Narmer Palette. Said King Narmer, the term Pharaoh did not exist, it's much later. So King Narmer basically dispelling chaos and establishing order. Every civilization does the same thing. So forces of light and darkness, or demons and gods, or Darul Islam and Darul Harb. It's a little different, but there is always the Persians, Zoroastrians also talk about that. Christians talk about that. Every civilization has a conception of good and evil, and chaos and order, forces of light and darkness, and that's basically what my sense of all Americans talk about. And always communism and Islam, terrorism, bad forces, and United States maintain stability in the whole world. And I discussed that in my book. The Europeans talk about civilized, uncivilized forces of again prosperity and the forces of backwardness, forwardness. I know the post-colonials don't like binaries, but that's too bad because binaries exist in every civilization. You cannot just bury your head in the sand and say we don't like binaries. But that's what the reality is. You can overcome the binaries, and that's what I end up by saying that the West versus the rest should go, but that doesn't mean you don't acknowledge it. That's not good scholarship. Okay. But I think the key idea is that it's not a monopoly of any civilization, but a shared creation. And how do I prove the idea of shared creation? Is I look at some of the core elements of world order. So, for example, empire. Empire is actually very big. And we are all children of empire. We all live in empires, right? Depends on which empire we're talking about. Going from the Mauryan Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Gupta Empire before that, and the British Empire. And India is an empire in many ways. So is the United States. So is China. So is almost every state is a product of an empire, of the legacy empire. So it doesn't sound good to say that, but it is the reality that without empire, we cannot understand world order today or the future. And also independence of states, which is anti-empire, post-colonial, anti-colonial. We have to break up the empire and become independent. So what do you call anarchy? System of independent states. So you have an international system where there is no empire, or it could be pre-empire, like the Indian republics before Maurya empire created the, or maybe the Nandas did it before, but the Mauryans basically created still one of the largest empires in India until the British. Only the Mughals under Aurangzeb managed to match it by going towards the Deccan. But otherwise, the Mauryan Empire is the most complete empire of India. And that's why when people say India is a British creation, you should laugh at it, ignorant, because there was a traditional conception of India, of the empire of India. The Chinese empire came 100 years later, but still very, very important. But both India and China had independent states before the empire. So the Maurya Empire got rid of the republics, like the Magadha became preponderant, got rid of like the Sakya Republic, where exactly Buddha was born. The Chinese Qing Empire coming 100 years after the Mauryas unified China, getting rid of the warring states like the Zhou and the Qin. The Qin actually were like the Mauryas of India. That's Chin with what to China, what Aryans was to India. So they got rid of all the independent states to create the empire. But that doesn't mean we can forget about the legacy of those independent states. But actually, neither India nor China created this system. It was Sumerians that created the system. So they had the first system of independent states. The Mayas had a system of independent states. The Greeks came much later. Athens and Sparta, they created independent states. So that also is not a Western. Westphalia is the most developed form of system of independent states. So Westphalia came 1648, but they were preceded by whole series of systems of independent states. So diplomacy, how to conduct diplomacy, very ancient invention. I can go back to the even 2000 BC. That millennia, third millennia BC, but the most concrete expression, the proof we have also in the moment was in the ancient Near East, 15th century BC, and around that time, Egypt and its neighbors conducted a very elaborate system of diplomacy, and it's called the Amarna diplomacy, after the Egyptian capital of the Middle Kingdom, so the New Kingdom, which headquarters to Amarna. So it's called the Amarna diplomacy, and it's well documented. We have a lot of cuneiform tablets of the correspondence and the like. I'll show you that. Free trade also not invented by the British, by the Americans. Certainly, it was actually in the Indian Ocean area for a long period of time in practice, and even sometimes documented. Humanitarian values, protecting people, civilians in warfare, dismounted soldiers, humanitarian just war principles that you might have read in ancient India, in Mahabharata: don't fight after dark, or don't kill an injured soldier, do not harm civilians. Even some of these norms said don't use poisonous weapons, chemical weapons. And that's not only in Mahabharata, but also in Code of Manu and almost even in Kautilya. Despite being a realist, had very significant dose of humanitarian values. And you can find that in Islam, you can find that in Africa, find that every civilization, and of course Europe and the West. So what I'm saying is that the core foundations of world order, whether you are a realist and talk about empire and independence of states, whether a liberal talked about peace treaties, diplomacy, free trade, and or constructivists talk about humanitarian values, they all have multiple global origins, not the monopoly of any single country, a single state. And many of them were actually created before the rise of the West. The rise of the West, in the, so if it's the 16th century onwards, uh, all these ideas were already there. Another thing I can add is the rational mode of inquiry. I'll talk about it, how the universe was created. Now, the only exception to this Western thing, that when I say they were not invented in the West, by doing something wrong, the phone or something. Yeah. Um, so the only exception to that, what about Greece and Rome, right? Greece and Rome are also creators of some of these ideas, particularly ancient Greece. But that's true. But as I was saying yesterday, ancient Greece never saw itself as a part of the West. The West saw itself as the successor of ancient Greece. But ancient Greeks never thought of Europe or anybody else for that matter as part of it. No, there's no phone there. Phone is over there. I can move it but otherwise what's the period there? The phone is over there. If you want, I can turn it up. But you have ocean. Ancient Greece never really saw itself as part of the West. The modern West, not the original, until the Renaissance, so Europeans never thought ancient Greece as their ancestor. But after Renaissance and Enlightenment, Europeans looking for a kind of a uh, ancestor civilization found Greece and Rome as the king. But even what the Greeks and Romans invented was not perfect. Greek democracy was not a perfect democracy. So all these ideas I'm talking about, none of them are perfectly similar to what we have today. Uh, but they were similar to the Athenian democracy, which was, I'll call it 12.7% democracy. That's the number of people who could vote in the area, or democracy without liberty. But we still give credit to Greek for democracy. But despite having a very perfect number form. But there are many of these ideas were developed maybe in foundational, so-called imperfect form, but some actually in very developed. This idea of humanitarian values of a just war, not harming civilians in combat, not harming soldiers who have surrendered or have been afflicted with disease or even sorrow, not harming them, is much more developed in ancient India than in than today in the Geneva Conventions, and they were actually obeyed. Not because India is peaceful. India was never a very peaceful country, but it's precisely the point. You have rules and norms to manage conflict so that it doesn't lead to total chaos and breakdown. So, as some Indian scholars who are actually real historians, as opposed to people, pundits that talk about history, so India was not a peaceful country, but it invented and developed principles and norms to manage conflict peacefully. There's a big difference. No civilization is peaceful. So all civilizations have elements of attraction and ugliness, peace and violence. So to say that we don't have a peace gene, sorry, we have a peace gene. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping sometimes says that the Chinese have a peace gene. That's nonsense. So is the Indians when they say we're totally peaceful. Uh, we're not. But there are ways of managing conflict peacefully. And I think India provides the best example of that, by far the best example. Because these norms, and I will talk about in a moment, it's in the New York Times article, please read that. The New York Times was fascinated by this example. That's the credit that India should get. Okay, but a lot of civilizations get credit for a lot of different things. So moving on then, that's the first and core point, that civilization, sorry, world order is not a monopoly, but a shared creation. A lot of these elements came from multiple places, sometimes in similar forms, sometimes in different forms, but then the later on coalesced as the world became more connected, ideas could travel, and so they influence each other. The West was influenced by the rest, or you can say Europe was influenced by China, India, Islam, and later on Europeans also influenced their colonies and ex-colonies. So it's a mutual construction of world order rather than a singular monopolistic construction of world order. And that is really the key message of the book. Through its all the chapters, I go through all the civilizations, what is their main creation, how is it similar or different from others, and what impact it may have for today. That's what I would cover in my 14 chapters, including the introduction and conclusion. Now, there are a number of subsidiary arguments, one including more later period. So the rise of the West depended on Europe's borrowing of ideas and innovations from non-Western civilizations, and of course, extracting resources like gold and silver from Latin America, human resources, slaves from Africa, and also manufactured items from India, which was the largest manufacturer in the world around the time, the height of the Mughal Empire, the largest country in the world. But a lot of that because they had a large population and was a leading manufacturer of cotton clothing. Cotton that created the initial basis for the British Industrial Revolution. The British imported cotton from India, cotton textiles, to the British India Company, then banned the import because they wanted to give British manufacturers time. It's like protectionism, the Calico Acts, time to develop their own manufacturing. Initially, basically borrowing from Indian technology, and within a few decades, India become uh, goes from being number one uh, cotton textile manufacturer, also number one economy, to zero, less than 5% of the world economy, and Britain becomes the largest exporter of textiles in the world, and cotton textiles, and it founded the British Industrial Revolution, and of course the European Industrial Revolution. So that's one example that I discuss in the book, but there are many such examples. For ideas of world order, ideas of philosophy, not talking about scientific ideas, ideas about empire, ideas about monarchy, many of these ideas of world order, humanitarian values, also the West borrowed. Philosophy is a very major example, and that's where Islam played a very key role. We'll talk about it. Uh, in fact, there's a book going around by this William Dalrymple about India. It only tells you, I don't particularly like playing off one civilization against another, but actually, the philosophical ideas from the Islamic world are far more significant in the rise of the West. The invention of zero is important. I think it's very important. But there are a lot more ideas that came from Middle East and what is today's Middle East, the Islamic world, which also covered India, by the way. Uh, Non-Western societies, global South, coming more toward the contemporary period, have never been passive beneficiary, but active contributors or creators of post-World War II order. So the what we call the liberal international order, America did everything, not true. If you actually look at the UN documents, you do the research, you'll find the global South countries, there were majority, I think I might have mentioned this yesterday, about 30 participants in the San Francisco conference to draft the UN Charter are actually from what we call today global South, including India, represented by the viceroy, one person from the viceroy's council. So under British Empire, but was allowed to, because of Americans specifically, President Roosevelt wanted India to participate independently. But it was not completely independent because the person who went from to represent India was the council of the viceroy, advisory council or executive council. Same for Philippines, but they did play a role. I mean, those people from India, Philippines played a role, but you can see that even the committees were chaired in most cases by white Westerners and men, basically. The representatives of colonial or post-colonial societies played a very important role in modifying, altering texts, challenging, where there is a racism or ethnocentrism. I gave you the example of Mrs. Hansa Mehta, who actually said we cannot have all men are created equal. We should have all human beings are created equal. She did that not at San Francisco, but in the United Nations Human Rights Committee. But they did that kind of role, creating language and protesting exclusion of certain things. They couldn't do everything. The racism and colonialism not mentioned much in the UN Charter, and because the documents, if you look at the actual documents, uh, the debate was there, but finally it didn't get through. So that brings me to uh, this point that many of the ideas we have in the UN system and the multilateral system, including racial equality, including anti-colonial norms, including human rights norms, and human rights, they were actually contributed after the UN Charter, and largely because of the leadership of global South countries. And that includes India as well. At that time, Nehru was a big champion. Bandung Conference, Asia Africa Conference, defined the norm of racial equality. It's not sovereign equality, but racial equality. And that language was adopted by the UN in form of a special resolution much later. Okay, so and then so whatever was the gap in the UN Charter when it comes to anti-colonialism, anti-racism, or gender equality, was filled in human rights at initially in conferences among the global south countries or post-colonial states, and Bandung conference is absolutely essential for that. But other regional organizations, and then they got adopted into the UN system in the form of human rights covenants, declarations on racial equality, and the like. So it is wrong to say actually that global south countries were passive and just benefiting from Western leadership. It's not a normative, politically correct thing for me to say. It's actually a fact. And the fact, the reason why we don't know much about it is because many people don't do the research, and those who do, small group of very dedicated scholars, they don't have the reach. So you need to have integrate this. Again, we are talking about post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is not just about ex-colonial countries or colonialism. It's also about whole world order. When you talk about Bandung Conference, the conference of Asia and African countries, right? Well, the Asia played a more important role than Africa because most African countries were under colonial. I think all African countries, I mean, if you unless you consider Egypt, but the sub-Saharan Africa, first sub-Saharan Africa country that became independent was Ghana in 1956, 57. So Bandung happened in 55. So Nkrumah was inspired by Bandung, but he couldn't attend Bandung because the British prevented him from coming to Bandung because he was still under British dominion, not British colony, but dominion. So what happened then? The global South countries fill in the gaps and advance ideas that were already there or neglected. Because Winston Churchill had said we cannot discuss colonialism in the UN, San Francisco. If we do, Britain will not participate because Britain still had lots of colonies, including India. So the Americans went along, and because Britain still was a big honcho at that time, so colonialism gets very hardly any mention. I have a chart. You can see there are less than 10 or 20 mentions of colonialism and race in the UN Charter, 21 volumes of that San Francisco conference. But the global South countries who could not have their say in every area did that afterwards. When they become independent, whether it's the Bandung conference, the Nkrumah organized the first Pan-African conference, the non-alignment later, which is an outgrowth of these movements, Pan-African, Pan-Asian, Africa-Asia conference, they advocated these ideas. And because of the increasingly becoming the numerical majority, they were able to adopt resolutions and give it the force of multilateral norms. Okay, so there are many other examples of agency, but this is one example. But never forget the majority of countries in San Francisco conference were from today's global south. And the decline of Western dominance doesn't mean the end of world order. So a lot of people think that the world order is collapsing today. Now, it started initially 20, 25 years ago as a kind of a concern in the West about its own relative decline. And the United States also had this debate about whether America is declining or not. Then it becomes a concern with what we call today as the liberal international order. You know, the liberal international order. It's a very stylized way of talking about American-led post-World War II world order created and encoded through multilateral institutions, free trade, and democracy. Now, that order looked very alive and well in 2014. When Barack Obama was president, Hillary Clinton was waiting in the wings after being Secretary of State. Trump was not in the horizon as a serious candidate for presidency. So just 10 years ago, 2015, the liberal international order looked alive and well. Not only alive and well, people thought it will last for a very long time. It will thwart challenges like China and India. So China and India have benefited a lot, which is true, by the way, from the liberal order, but they will also support it. What they forgot is that China and India might have benefited from it, but mostly in the economic sense, not the political and security sense. India was always in the receiving end of uh, American diplomacy. India's best friend was the Soviet Union, not the United States, especially when it comes to India-Pakistan conflict. China, of course, was always threatened with a nuclear bomb by the Americans during Korean War. So, so how did they benefit from the liberal order comprehensively? Economically, they did, but only after the Deng Xiaoping reforms and Manmohan Singh reforms in the two countries. So one should not dismiss this idea that they're completely uh, on the receiving end, on the wrong side, or well, they were on the wrong side, but they did not benefit. But at the same time, they did not benefit in every area. And that's the reason why when I wrote a book in 2014 called The End of American World Order, I made that point. Just because they have benefited on economic side more recently, they didn't do it before. Uh, Means they have benefited in the security or political sense, and even if they benefited overall, it doesn't mean they're going to support the liberal order, not have their own voice. So, going back to the point I was making, the big point, that first we thought about the decline of the world order, Western dominance, with the rise of China and India. Then we talk about only recently, after Trump, the end of the liberal international order. And now we're talking about the end of world order completely. That whole world is collapsing. So my book in 2014 was the first book ever to say America is not declining. We don't know that as a country, but the order it built is declining, is ending. So the end of American world order did not mean the end of American dominance or American primacy or America as number one, but the liberal international order. The cover of the book says the liberal order it built is ending. That's the first time anybody mentioned the liberal order ending in 2014, just 2 years before Trump coming into campaign. Nobody else believed it at that time. Now everybody, that's the conventional wisdom. I still don't think the United States is declining as much as people think. The United States remains number one in the world overall, security, economics, finance, technology. If you bring those four things, forget about soft power or values. But if you look at economic power, particularly financial power, security alliances, security power projection, military power projection ability, look about technology, and you look at the uh, yes, technology and more advanced technology, AI, artificial intelligence. All these indices of power, if you combine them, United States still leads the world, and will likely to lead for quite some time. But the order it built is gone. So you might think what's happened? Trump is, reviving America, right? So coercing China, coercing Japan, coercing Indonesia, Philippines, and now European Union to have a deal. Well, that proves my point that America may not be declining. It has a lot of coercive power. But this is not the order that it built. It's not the liberal order based on reciprocity, mutual benefit, and norms of free trade. This is not free trade. This is not democracy. This is not multilateralism. So, proves my point. What Trump is doing is basically exactly what I said. America may or may not be declining, but the order it built is declining. So the new order could be transactional. The new order could be something else. I call it multiplex. But certainly, it doesn't mean the end of world order. It's the end of the liberal order. There could be a new kind of order, and we can debate. I can talk about it. What is the new order? Is it a spheres of influence? It could be multipolarity. It could be China-US bipolarity, or my own idea of a multiplex. That we can debate. But there is no question that the liberal order is gone. It may remain as a rump, one small part of what we see today, but it's not the hegemonic dominant order that we used to think. Not earlier, sorry, even less than 10 years ago, not more than 10 years ago. And finally, the future. So what comes in the future? So I call it multiplex, not multipolar. There's a reason for it. It's not unipolar. Polarity, generally go away from polarity. So substitute polarity with complexity. What we have is not just the world order determined by economic power, military power, but types of interdependence, ideas, norms, leadership, different levels of cooperation and conflict, global, regional, multilateral, and minilateral. Is world is complex, not a simple world where you have two superpowers calling the shots, or you have one uh, United States liberal hegemon or unipolar. You have so many different actors and complexity that it's not even multipolar because it's not about great powers alone. Great powers is basically the main actors in multipolarity. We have non-state actors, regional powers, so a proliferation of actors and forms of cooperation that is not captured by multipolar, which is a great power club basically. So that world is multiplex, where leadership and influence are spread among different powers, regions, and civilizations. Very different from any definition of multipolar or unipolar or bipolar. So basically, these are the key points that I want to make. I do make in the book, and I want to pay attention to when you take a look at the book. So I will now go through a few examples in the next 10 to 15 minutes that illustrates this what I call a shared creation. And again, you can only make sense of it when you read the book and go into the details of it. So I talked about shared creation. These are the 10. I selected them very arbitrarily. There are many such innovations uh, that laid the foundation of contemporary world order that came from societies other than the West. Some of them did come from the West too, but the West is sometimes the latecomer rather than the creator, especially the rising West minus Greece and Rome. But even including Greece and Rome, you can also make this argument. So independent state system I mentioned, diplomacy and peace treaties. Uh, Persia created the first universal empire with tolerance of other religions and ethnic groups. Ancient India Joshua principles, head of Geneva Conventions or Magna Carta. Chinese public service system was emulated by the British uh, from India, British East India Company first emulated public service examination, just like your civil service here. Like anybody can appear. I don't know that that's still true, but it's not based on heredity like before. That if you the kings and queens want to recruit officials, and they will first turn to the nobility. So the in a son or a daughter of a noble class, property class, a serf, a lord, rather than go to the common people. And the Chinese are the first civilization that created a civil service, or they call it public service, where anybody can go and take a test, just like the way you do. Prepare, drive yourself crazy, and then you will have a week of examination, different levels, like you have state level, prelims, final. They also had something similar. You can go to the county level, the state level, and then go to the national level. And that's the cruelest, most difficult. You sit in this little cubicle, um, you have a little, while you have your writing ink, and I think when they got paper, they had paper, and you have read all the classics, like all the Confucian classics in particular, because you'll be tested on that. Questions will come from that. Questions are hidden. Nobody knows what the questions are going to be. There will be examiners, and there will be the big security everywhere. Nobody's allowed in. Nobody's allowed out. For the duration of the exam, only except bathroom breaks, and somebody will probably accompany you to the bathroom, and you answer the question, and it is marked by a committee uh, totally anonymously. Your names are erased from the paper. Nobody knows who wrote this. They have an elaborate system of preventing that. Then the results are announced. It's just like, you see the pictures, people going and looking at the wall, the names are there. And those who passed, ecstatic. They go to their home. And I think I had a friend in JNU who got into one of the civil service, IAS, and he in Darbhanga or somewhere. And he was telling me when he got IAS, when there people came from the railway station, heard him and singing and dancing because it's such a big thing. That's exactly what the Chinese did before, until the Qing dynasty. If you pass the exam, the village will celebrate, your family will celebrate, because from zero to become hero, your life is set. You will be a magistrate, a commissioner. The remarkable thing is, China's emperor had nothing to do with this. Not even aware of who is getting. Sometimes the emperor will look at some papers if the examiner say, "Ah, this is a fantastic paper. You should hire this person because it can help administration." So it was completely meritocratic. So don't dismiss when people say China's meritocracy is a chimera. No, it's not. And the British saw this, the French saw this, because during those times, the French were trying to be a democracy uh, from the ancient regime, and but they had no choice. Every time they want to hire somebody to the civil service, the same nobility, the ancient regime, the children would sort of come in. Voltaire and others thought, no, we should adopt the Chinese system. The Jesuits had passed that knowledge to them. I said, well, this is how we produce change. We don't depend on the nobility because the nobility will never change the system. They will perpetuate the system, right? So they also adopted this. But the British did it in a very systematic way because the East India Company in India had an office in Canton, which is Guangzhou, where my wife was born, we have been there a few times. They thought, oh, Chinese are we don't have to rely on so the same British aristocracy is notorious, right? So they monopolize everything. And most of them, there was a British cabinet minister, treasury minister, who have a quote. I'll make sure you some point that the British system of recruiting public servants is so antiquated that almost any idiot can become a civil servant just because you are born in the right family. They can't read or write, but we have to hire them because we don't have the system. So they studied the Chinese system initially from East India Company, which then introduced the system to their offices in London, Halesbury, where East India Company had a training institute. The British government got to know about this. They reformed the civil service in the 1860s. Americans got the idea from the British. They also knew about China, but China is not to be trusted. But they said, oh, the advocates of civil service reform in the US in the late 19th century thought, if our friends from Britain can do this, and we got our constitution and democracy from Britain, if British can learn from China, why can't we? That's how they did it. So the modern West, the modern world owes this open meritocratic recruitment to civil service from ancient China. And that is a key foundation of world order. Rational bureaucracy, rational here means not based on heredity, is the foundation of world order. For me, the Chinese contribution to world order is not the gunpowder printing press. Those are important. What people miss is this is very important. So I try to look at things that people often miss. Then West of Islamic philosophy, I'll talk about it in a slide. The idea of rationality. The world was created not by God, but also by forces of nature, or maybe by both. Trying to reconcile natural with divine creation, which helped the Catholic Church, which fought the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church um, when at a time when the European rationalists were trying to challenge the divine creationism of the Catholic Church and said the world was created by natural forces, so maybe the Pope and the God doesn't have so much influence. And they were reviving an ancient Greek philosophy, which had passed from them to the Islamic world. And Islamic world had philosophers from Persia, from Arab, from North Africa, from Morocco. They developed this into a very systematic philosophy called the doctrine of the eternity of the world. And that got translated back, in a sense, from Greek to Islamic world, back to uh, not to Greece per se, but to Europe. That gave ammunition to the European scholars, philosophers, to carry on their fight against the Catholic Church. And finally, they prevailed. So we have Enlightenment, we have Renaissance. And the property right in West Africa, very similar. There are few ways of having property, and you cannot just appropriate property. I'll talk about this. The Mongols in the Indian Ocean have created connectivity, first globalization over land, over sea. And that's what benefited the Europeans, not only benefited Eurasian countries, Indian Ocean countries, but Europeans. Then the pre-Columbian civilizations, I talked about independent states in Maya, Inca, and Inca was an empire but very decentralized, like the Gupta Empire in India. Iroquois in North America, in New York and Canada, that area, peaceful coexistence, confederacy, having models for long-term stability. And then post-colonial nations created norms of determination, racial equality, and multilateralism. Now, I discuss many of these, all of this, and plus many more in the book to prove. No, I am not saying the non-West created everything. The West also created a lot of things, but this whole idea of West and non-West is very artificial. So there's no such distinction before 18th century. So there was a continuous process of mutual learning, whether in conflict or cooperation. I'm not saying there were no conflicts, okay? But conflicts were also time of confusion. So the Crusades, for example, was a time when a lot of Europeans got to know about Islamic religion, Islamic philosophy. And of course, the ones that were blinded by faith, they fought. But they brought in also philosophers came in, translators came in to Syria, for example, which was the Levant area, which is where in the old age, people could be trilingual. They could speak Pharaonic Egyptian, they could speak Greek, they could speak Arabic, and they could actually erect a Rosetta Stone, and they could translate. Then similar translations happened in Cordoba in Spain. So when Arabic texts were translated back into, well, not back per se, but into Latin and especially to French, medieval French. So those things actually happened a lot throughout the history. I talk about this the circulation of knowledge, shared creation through circulation, and sometimes through independent innovation. Some civilizations did things on their own without learning from each other. So that's the story of world order. And if you want to know more, there's a lot more in the book. Now, in terms of time, I have time for the examples. Another 10 minutes before I go to uh, other part. So this is talking about the first peace treaty. So this is one of the clauses of the Kadesh Treaty, Treaty of Kadesh, which was fought between Ramses II, the great pharaoh of Egypt, and initially was fought by another Hittite king, but the treaty was signed by his successor between Ramses and him, Hattusilis. So 1259. The war was fought 15 years, 16 years before. So among the many principles is the non-aggression. The prince of Hatti shall not trespass against the land of Egypt. Reciprocal, ruler of Egypt shall not trespass against the land of Hatti. So there are many others, mutual, not interfering in each other's domestic affairs, not just foreign aggression, and extradition. If a bad person, like a terrorist or a killer from Egypt, killed somebody and went across the border to the Hittite kingdom, the Hittite ruler will not give asylum, send that person back to Egypt for prosecution. So you have extradition. Same thing also if something happened against the Hittite ruler, went to Egypt, Egyptian pharaoh will send him back. There is also alliance. If Egypt is attacked by a third party, let's say Babylon or Assyria, which was a big bully at that time, so the king of Hatti will send forces to support Egypt. Hatti is attacked by, say, Mitanni, which is also a big bully at that time. I mean, they're all bullies and also great powers. The Egyptians will support Hatti. So see, NATO, US, Japan treaty, many more. But those are some of the key examples of reciprocity, mutual assistance, also non-aggression and non-interference. Now, this is almost so strikingly similar to modern principles of this did not happen in Europe. It came from what we call today the Near East, the Amana system, and it's documented. No, we're not imagining these things. It's in cuneiform tablets in Akkadian language, translated. Copies are available. One of them is actually written in well, the tablets are actually in Istanbul Archaeological Museum. I have photos of that. I have an article in Foreign Policy magazine that reproduces those photos. Just came out a few days ago. And then there is also, if you go to the Karnak Temple or the Ramesseum in Egypt, Ramses II built a fort, and in the back of it, this treaty is written. So it's not false, okay? Not fake news. It's a real thing. So another example, oh, uh, Mare Liberum, freedom of the seas. We credit it to Grotius, uh, who was actually hired by the Dutch lawyer to defend the looting of Portuguese sea of Singapore in 1603, but the Dutch went to establish their own monopoly. Now, why the Dutch looted the Portuguese ship? Because the Portuguese were denying them right to trade in the Indies. The Portuguese were here first, right? Calicut, Goa, Malacca. They established a main naval sort of power projection in both in India and also in Malacca, power projection base basically. So they harassed shipping. They would not allow traders to trade with each other. They wanted protection money cut. They said, you sell it to us, we'll sell it to your trader. As opposed to, say, India selling to Malacca, Malacca selling to Malacca, or Makassar selling spices to Europe via Malacca. The Portuguese said, you sell it to us, and we will sell it for you. We'll give you a share of the profit. And the Portuguese didn't like it. So the Dutch did not like it. They were the second to come to the Indian Ocean, and they attacked the Shanka Portuguese ship. There's a long story about it. And the whole thing went to court, well, arbitration in the Admiralty in Amsterdam. So the BOC, the Dutch hired a young lawyer called Hugo Grotius, or the Groot. And he wrote a brief called The Right of the Dutch to Trade in the Indies. And chapter of that became Mare Liberum. Basically said, world sea is free. But where did he get the idea? Because there was no freedom of seas in the Mediterranean. Mediterranean Sea was parceled out, belonged to different cities, different city-states, Venice, Genoa, and even in the Hanseatic League in Europe, Britain said, this is my sea, this is your sea, just like we claim territorial sea. The Indian Ocean had no concept of territorial sea. The jurisdiction of the empires stopped on land. Everybody could trade. There were no empires controlling trade like the British did or the Americans did later as a great power. The free trade here was controlled by small city-states, Malindi, Zanzibar, Malacca, Mogadishu, Aden, Hormuz, Calicut. None of them are empires, right? And Masaliputam, bit of Tamra Lipti there, which is Odisha Bengal border, Malacca, Sumatra, and then it went to the north, the Chinese, Japanese area. But the Indian Ocean part was completely managed by small port city-states, no hegemon. So think about, you don't need a hegemon to have free trade. And political science has recognized this. I have another book with a colleague from a student called Comparing Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. Even political science like Stephen Krasner have challenged the idea that only the hegemon can provide free trade. In fact, hegemons don't provide free trade. Small states do, because their life depends on it. And they did it very remarkably. Grotius did not invent free trade. He knew about this. This was the case about the Indian Ocean. He had access to documents the Dutch provided to learn about what's happening in the Indian Ocean. He might have consulted some practices with the Mediterranean. As I said, you can have trade in the Mediterranean freely only if you are a subject of the Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire, right? Similarly, the Hanseatic League could you have free trade if your bosses permit you. In the Indian Ocean, there was no empire, didn't need anybody's permission. Anybody could trade as long as you pay customs duty. So small states, even from my home state of Odisha, traders went to Malacca. It's mentioned in to these documents. They didn't were sent by the king. They were private traders. Most of this was private little traders. Some of them are big traders. And anybody is welcome. Malacca had more than 80 languages, communities. The trade was managed not by the Sultan, but by a committee of 10 people, including Kalingans, and Arabs, Chinese, Javanese, they decided the rules of the trade, not the Sultan. Sultan never interfered in this trade. That's free trade for you. That system existed for about 1,000 years. And then come Grotius, writes a treaty, and we call him the father of mare liberum, or freedom of sea. And he's also a founder of the liberal international order, liberal internationalist. But what he did was help the Dutch to make their case against the Portuguese, but he was on the payroll of the Dutch East India Company, as is the captain of the ship who sank the Portuguese ship, was a cousin of Grotius, the family thing almost. And the Dutch went to establish a bigger monopoly than the Portuguese, much more powerful monopoly, because the Portuguese were never a great power. The Dutch were a great power. They started doing the same thing. We can't trade with each other, trade it to us. When he did that, the Sultan of Makassar, sorry, I'm going one step ahead. I have to go back. Okay. Uh, Sultan of Makassar, well, old name was Goa. Makassar was the capital of Goa. God made the land and the sea. The land he divided among men, and the sea gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone could be forbidden to sell the seas. So that's freedom of trade, I see for you. It's documented. Malacca's laws are documented. There is a law, maritime laws of Malacca, 15th century. Again, written by sea captains, not by pundits or scholars. The people who actually practice the trade wrote this up. Okay, so there you go. Then we go to a couple of more examples, and I talked about humanitarian values. Well, this is very clear. Compare Geneva Conventions, not harming soldiers who have laid down their arms or have been rendered inactive by sickness, wounds, detention. Then you have in Code of Manu. The Manu has some bad qualities. I mean, he did not recognize women. So we criticize him fairly. We should. But this is a code. He didn't write it. This is actually in practice. So you will find echoes of that even in Kautilya, not harming non-combatants, which are arts realists. You'll find that in Mahabharata. So we find the most documented and consolidated sort of a legal form is in Code of Manu. Okay, this is not endorsed what everything Manu said, but if you find that, and there may not be any such person called Manu. It's a code that came from generations of actual practice. So don't harm soldiers. He fights with his foes in battle, who has surrendered, who has sat down, who says, I'm yours, who sleeps, who is disarmed, whose weapons are broken, who is wounded, and who is fleeing in fear. And there is also other parts of that that don't use poisonous weapons. So use of poisonous weapons is not right in battle. Okay, so that doesn't mean it was not violated, but the rules are there. And not because India was a very peaceful country, but because there was so much war that these sort of rules actually to reduce violence and control violence. Property rights. We give credit to Magna Carta. Property right is the basis of human rights. No property can be confiscated without lawful judgment. Payment for property, compensation for property, inheritance must be respected. Look at the Mandan Charter. About the same time in Mali, the Empire of Mali, one of the largest empires in the world at that time. There are 5 ways of acquiring property: buying, donation, exchange, work, inheritance. Any other form without convincing testimony is doubtful. The only difference is that it was not written in paper. All the Kuruk and Fuga is stone, but it was laid down and was passed on verbally from generations. Like a lot of knowledge about Vedas in India is from oral history. That doesn't mean they're wrong. They have been distorted. And Magna Carta also, after it was proclaimed, it was nullified by the Pope about a decade later. Pope said basically, this is a coercion against the king, who is a good disciple of the Pope. And these are illegal serfs having a sword or gun or what there's a sword or club, telling, look, standing behind, maybe out of respect but out of threat. Look at how they're looking, and the king is being forced to sign this. And the Pope said, you cannot do that. Null and void in perpetuity. So they have to redo it over and over again before it became part of the British legal tradition. Whereas Sundiata Keita, the leader of the Malinke people who founded Mali Empire, goes there, sits there, and says, "This is an imaginary drawing, right? But you can imagine how this happened because there's a lot of research done on it. It's a UNESCO translation of this. Uh, Basically, everybody, all the warriors, clan is there, said, these are the laws, these are the rules. I've only selected five. Very humanitarian principle, was by its own time, very, very progressive. Everybody has a right to life. Okay. Preservation of physical integrity. Women should be associated with all our management. Do not ill treat the slaves. Do not do wrong to foreigners. Before setting fire to the bush, don't look at the ground. Raise your head in the direction of the top of the trees. If they don't bear fruits or flowers. Now, and of course, the most important thing. So again, it's not like Magna Carta that we don't have a document from that period, but it's there. So these are proto foundations. And the Magna Carta, by the way, benefited only those guys, the big landowning class, the lords. So it did not benefit at all the peasant. In fact, it led to further exploitation of peasants because now they have property rights. So nobody can take away their property. So they can do whatever they want to do. So it empowered the aristocracy against the peasantry. Whereas the Puro and Fuga, Mandan Charter, benefited everybody, not just uh, the landed class or the upper class or the nobility. So I think this is nobody knows about this. In fact, some of my African friends get puzzled and startled when I say this. And finally, I will say one more thing and then we stop. So I talk about rational mode of inquiry, God or nature. Now, it's a bit tricky, right? We all have beliefs in God, Christianity, most Islam, Hindu, but philosophy is about questioning, rational mode of inquiry, not basically rejecting or accepting, but debating. That's what Amartya Sen said, argumentative Indian. So this is an example of philosophy. And it also existed in Rig Veda, has a passage about who created the world and God comes afterwards, the world was created. But we have very substantial evidence from the literature about the late antiquity, early medieval period, middle period, and the role of Islamic philosophers. Now, Aristotle and the Greeks had this idea of natural creation. The Greeks were kind of always complex. So they also believe in God, oracles, very superstitious, but they also have scientists and they also have philosophers who say that world was created and is driven by natural forces, including earth, water, fire, and of course all kinds of non-god-like forces. Now that idea had died out with the destruction of Greek civilization by the Romans and the takeover of Christianity. When the Byzantine Empire was founded, Eastern Roman Empire, after the destruction of the Western Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire also controlled Greece. And one of the first things they did was to close down the Academy of Athens, the academy where Plato, Aristotle created these ideas. So everything became subject to the orthodoxy of the Christian religion, not only in Byzantine Empire but also in the Catholic doctrine, not the now what we call the Orthodox Christianity, but also in the original Catholic Christianity. So the God universe was created by God in a single act of creation out of nothing. Now, the Islamic philosophers are very deeply influenced by the Greeks. No question about it. They preserved, they translated a lot of Greek texts, as they did Indian and Chinese texts, but nothing like the translations of the Greek text. In a place called House of Wisdom in Baghdad in the 9th century, and Caliph al-Mamun basically bought a lot of books, collected a lot of books, had a whole bunch of translators. Many of them are trilingual, translated from Egypt, but especially bilingual, Greeks to Arabic and vice versa. And they preserved this knowledge. And when the Abbasid Caliphate moved to, well, was, sorry, first it was the Umayyads. And then the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyads moved to Spain, to Cordoba in particular. They also created their own translation, but that was kind of a retranslation. So they allowed translations of text from Arabic to Latin and French and Vulgar English or medieval English, so to speak. Vulgar French and medieval English. So, because Spain is so close to the Europeans, heart of the Renaissance, before the Renaissance happened, translators could come in droves, and Cordoba was a very progressive, inclusive place. They did a lot of translation to European languages. So the knowledge passed on. But the Greeks were not, sorry, the Arabs were not just, or the Muslim philosophers are not just translating, they were also creating. And many of the texts they interpreted, advanced, and also created new ideas. So don't think of them as just translators. They also, translation is very important, but also they were creators. And this is not just about philosophy, but about a whole bunch of other things. But science, medicine, astronomy, uh, you have navigation, agriculture, and the like. This is a very important thing because the whole world today we call rational thinking, and so there was this uh, Ibn Rushd, Averroes to Christians in Latin version. He stepped in. He translated, sorry, not translated. He interpreted. Translation is not the right word. It's not. We don't know whether he could actually translate directly from Greek texts. But he was able to read Arabic. Of course, he's very proficient. He was a judge, and he interpreted in a way that was very much acceptable to the Christians. The European philosophers in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were trying to challenge the Catholic Church. And then uh, Thomas Aquinas, who was trying to find the middle ground, not antagonizing the church, but not also antagonizing the philosophers, because he happened to be the dean of the School of Divinity in the University of Paris, the most important university at that time. So he tried to borrow ideas from people like Ibn Rushd that say, we should not have to be either or. There is something from natural. You should pay attention to this, whether you accept it or not. So that's why uh, this Nicholas Pelham writes in The Economist, I buy that. Without the 12th century rationalist Ibn Rushd, the defense of Aristotelian philosophy against orthodox theologians, influencing people like Aquinas, enlightenment might not have happened. You might think it's a little exaggeration, but it's actually not. If you look at the next slide, when you have some of these things that are translated from Oriental or Asian languages, and mostly from Greek, from Greece, Greek language, and also from something from India as well. Algebra, this one particularly, Jizal in Hind. That's why zero was translated to this to Arabic and become Arabic numerals, which are really Indian numerals, came from Ujjain to the court of the Abbasids. Right. Surya Siddhanta and the other text. So you will find many examples. This is just a small example of sampling of many, many texts. And some of them, those texts, Greek texts, survived only in Arabic, not in the original form. And sometimes originals are found, but before that, the Europeans had already known about, like Aristotle's metaphysics. The first knowledge Europe got of metaphysics was in Arabic. Arabic texts translated into French or Latin. Similarly, you will find that uh, it's a little bit like Buddhism in India today. Many Buddhist texts were lost in India but survived in Chinese translation. The Chinese have taken a lot of that, translated, and ironically, sometimes we know about Indian Buddhist texts, Sanskrit Buddhist texts to retranslation. So that's how knowledge circulates. Okay. So this is the breakpoint. I give you some examples to prove my point of shared creation. There is many more from Americas, from Africa. Well, I gave one example from Africa, but we can talk about it. And then the second part, I'll talk about the modern world order, how this is being influenced, where is it going? And that'll be a smaller part of the book. There's only a couple of chapters in this, but I still go through it. So you want to take some questions, or you want to take a break and come back? Either way is fine with me. Take two questions and then you can break. So just take a 4 to 5 questions, maybe. Yeah.
Don't you think that world order is not a two-page, but it is a gray area? Because we have seen regarding the knowledge sharing, we all know that Chinese conceal the knowledge of paper. They conceal the knowledge of
Yeah.
regarding the knowledge of. They also conceal tea. How we all know that tea got smuggled to Britishers in India, and we also know the famous story of Baba Budan, how he smuggled coffee from Yemen, and so don't you think the knowledge sharing and other things is do not the mutual cooperation rather than a rise and fall of one empire? Uh,
Well, I don't see any difference between that. I mean, as I said, war, like crusades, were the time of kind of a knowledge transfer. When the Mongols conquered Eurasia, they transferred a lot of Chinese knowledge back to Europe. So empire is part of it, but there is also a lot of times when knowledge transfers without empire. The Buddhist ideas passed to China without Indian empire going to China or Chinese emperor getting involved in this. When Xuanzang came to India, it was against the will of the emperor. He was afraid of being arrested. And so he took shelter in a place called Turfan I visited recently. Emperor's empire had nothing to do with it. The Indian idea is going to Southeast Asia, to Malaysia, and well, basically Java, uh, Thailand, so-called, but Cambodia, Indianization within quotes of Southeast Asia was almost entirely peaceful. No empire was involved. The Cholas had a couple of raids in Southeast Asia uh, against Srivijaya, but that's only one example, two examples uh, in the 11th century. But no empire was involved. Uh, Sorry? Yeah, you can have sharing without empire, but you can also do through empire. War can happen as a mode of transmission because you don't need sharing. A lot of ideas actually invented independently. So the Inca, I didn't have time to go into it. They built an empire very similar to the decentralized empire that we have in under the Guptas, and also Persia, and to some extent Mongols, leaving provinces independent. They didn't learn it from Eurasia. They did it on their own. There is a possibility that the Incas might have the civilization of the Andes civilization might have also invented Jiro on their own without getting it from India. Just like cultivating crops, cotton was grown here in Egypt and in Peru without any proof of any contact. So don't make everything as a sharing doesn't mean diffusion. Sharing means also having similar ideas uh, in different locations on your own. Why? Because we are talking about human civilization. Sometimes we have similar problems and we find similar solutions. Empire is a classic example. Every part of the world had empire, with possible exception of North America before the United States. But that doesn't mean they learned it from each other. They did it because there's a problem of anarchy, a problem of chaos, and we have to expand territory. It's a human ambition. So similarly, humanitarian values as a way of regulating conflict, well, it's a practical solution to a problem that's faced by all. Trade. Every civilization, to be civilized, actually have to do trade. Some of them do freely, some of them less freely, privately, publicly, but in economic interdependence is a shared idea. So that's what I'm trying to tell you. Republic. We had republics in India, republics in Peru, sorry, in Maya, republics in Sumer, where like succession doesn't come through heredity. It can be semi-elected, clan-based, but not directly hereditary. Roman Republic, uh, Greeks. So there's no evidence that they all learn from each other. So because it's the idea that is to solve the problem of violence, you don't have to always create an empire. But that's another form of cooperation, coercion. but you can keep the states independent and let them manage their relationships through norms and respect and communication as the Westphalian European states. So I'm saying that don't think of everything as diffusion. It's a very attractive term. A lot of books have been written about diffusion, like Silk Roads or the book about how the world met the West, uh, Josephine Quinn. I have no problems with that, but not everything is diffusion. A lot of it is independent creation in different parts of the world because facing similar problems. There are a lot of similarities between the American Indians preserve their environment and the Aborigine state in Australia, Australian Aborigines, the term. So that's my point. Sharing doesn't mean uh, learning from each other. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you go ahead. Yeah.
So we see that this civilizational clash theory, Samantha Hunting, that is being referred to so many times, sort of creates that civilized versus barbarian theory. Is it this attempt by the West to sort of discredit the golden Islamic age, all the inspiration they are taking, like, of what we learned through the Crusades, the Crusading wars?
Yeah.
During these wars, Islamic during the golden Islamic period was a multicultural society. We have synagogues, we have Orthodox Christians living peacefully. And as the examples you noted, how the knowledge from the Carthage area to the Spanish area traveled very freely. So, is this an attempt by the West to sort of create a barrier so that no one learns that these knowledge were actually being transferred from the Islamic?
Well, you said several things there. First of all, class of civilization. Huntington, I don't fully accept his theory, but he didn't say the world is barbarian versus civilized. He basically said civilizations are innately antagonistic towards each other. But he didn't actually say that Asians are barbarians and Westerners are civilized. Maybe one or two lines here and there, but actually, he actually thought the West will be wrong to think of Asia as barbarians. Uh, but he certainly perpetuated the idea of civilizations clash with each other. And in terms of what the West is trying to suppress the knowledge about transmission, that's very true. And that's because of ignorance and racism, two things coming together, prejudice. So many of the European philosophers, and I discuss this extensively in one of my chapters, including Immanuel Kant, Hegel, uh, and David Hume, the rationalist, they were flaming racist. They didn't think non-Western civilizations, they didn't call them civilized. People are anything to contribute because they didn't know. Kant never went outside of his town or a province. But he talked about colonialism and the thing that human society can achieve its perfection in the European race, and the American Indians were the least knowledgeable and the most stupid people. He said a lot of things in his teaching and writing without having seen any of the world. So that's ignorance constituting prejudice at the same time. So a lot of the Western philosophers of that period, especially 18th and 19th century, were ignorant and racist at the same time. So we actually then accept those, including Immanuel Kant. Think about it, one of the most influential philosophers of the West and of anybody, anytime. So later on, we have textbooks that perpetuate this knowledge. So as I said, one of the great moments I have, most satisfying moments I have when I give these lectures is when the students in the audience sitting there will gasp, say, "Are you sure?" And well, Ibn Rushd saved, had the Enlightenment. They have never heard of Ibn Rushd. I show them a plate, an image. There's a fresco in the Vatican drawn by the master artist Raphael, and that has called Academy of Athens. It has Plato, Aristotle, Socrates in the middle, and most of these other people are actually Christian philosophers. But there is also Ibn Rushd sitting there, and there is a Jewish philosopher sitting there. Because there's Maimonides also there. May not be in the fresco, but he is recognized as one similar to Ibn Rushd. So how many textbooks you have that actually produce the fresco in the Vatican, right? So most of our students because they had never been taught. The textbooks never tell them. And I will show you a graphic way of showing this. Our books about world order. Look at this book, Henry Kissinger's World Order, the best-selling book on world order, published in 2014. Chapter 1, Europe. Chapter 2, Europe. Islam, a world in disorder. United States and Iran, of course, not very flattering. India, little section. Oh, what did I do? Okay. China and world order, a section of a chapter. Asia is the whole thing. One chapter, the United States, and end of the United States. So you begin with Europe and the United States. Everybody is in between. So that's what we read because that's the best-selling book in the world order. Many textbooks reproduce it. I think there are some exceptions, but there has never been a textbook written like this about world order, not world history per se, by non-Western scholar in English language that covers all civilizations of all times and starts in the right sequence, by the way. Not with Europe as the ideal type, everybody following or not following as generations, but with the Sumerian, Egyptian, Assyria, Babylonians, Greeks, Persian, India, China, Rome, Islam, Mongols, then Europe, pre-colonial America, Africa, Europe, United States, the return of the rest. That's the kind of knowledge we don't have from our textbooks. I'm not saying not everybody is ethnocentric, Eurocentric, but the mainstream textbooks start and end like this, whether it's history, philosophy, or political science, or international relations. So the West is doing the suppressing, uh, sometimes consciously, sometimes because that's how knowledge is produced. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
I think this is, I would like to appreciate the effort you have in this.
Tell me the question. Okay, save the appreciation. Yeah.
So yeah, my question is from differently divergent worlds. It is there's this chapter called The Rise of the Indo-Pacific and the Return of
Oh, Daryl Jervis.
Divergent Worlds. Yes.
Oh, my other, yeah, Manjit and I wrote the divergent role. Yeah, yeah, okay. What's the question?
Okay, so my question is, you said that China's maritime strategy does not aim for sea control. Rather, it follows three-dimensional approach. So, like, why do you think China is doing that? It is for
Okay, I don't want to get into this right now because that's a different book. Uh, and also, you should ask that to my co-author Manjit. I did the more historical part, and he did the Indo-Pacific part. So, the general argument of the book that Asia did not have a tradition of sea control, okay, because sea was never considered part of metropolitan territory. So the Chinese should be told about this, that you cannot say you have conquered the seas and you conquer South China Sea because the South China Sea is not part of the Indian Ocean. Okay, so it's a bit different. But generally, you cannot really aspire to sea control based on some historical precedent because there is no history. So that's what. So I was once giving a lecture to the United States Indo-Pacific Command officers, and I said, "Hey, when you talk about freedom of the sea, the Indian Ocean, talk about Sultan of Makassar, not the colonialist, racist Hugo Grotius, because that's where you have the tradition that Indian Ocean was always free and open and not nobody's territory. So that's the key point. So when the book talks about sea control, I really don't remember that passage, but the idea is that historically it will be difficult for China to reconcile that, even if the current government can do that. India is also doing the same thing. We have the law of the sea, allows territorial sea, EEZ, but sea control is a very different proposition. And a lot of historical evidence we still have, the people get jump into ecstasy when they talk about Chinese control over the Indian Ocean. Uh, Chinese have sea control in immediate surroundings, but even then, the United States is there. Americans have lost the control, so have the Chinese. So basically, they're kind of mutual negation. To do sea control in a place like Indo-Pacific, or I'm talking about the Indian Ocean, the Chinese have to have the support of the vast majority of our local states, allowing them to do sea control. They cannot sustain an independent operation, at least until now, without local support. So there is all this time a string of a lot of this is huge exaggerations, and they're written by basically people. I did my doctoral dissertation, PhD, my first book on American power projection capability. I think I know something about sea control and power projection. I find this laughable the way people exaggerate. There was a recent article said, "Oh, China has 23 ports where it can use against India, and India has nothing." India sits right there in the Indian Ocean. India has support until now, at least from Britain, Australia, Japan. China is very vulnerable to passes through the Straits of Malacca, and I don't even. I mean, China has an intention uh, in that way, but they have capacity and intention of denial. That's very different from sea control. Doesn't want the United States to come to the rescue of Taiwan. And China has the capacity to discourage American aircraft carriers coming anywhere close to its territory. Uh, that capacity of denial is not sea control. All right, last question. Yeah, very quickly.
But I would have like there's a different most of the ideas and concepts in both perspectives. So these facts and the knowledge also is well delivered. So you think that there are certain ideas or certain areas or certain knowledge that has not been explored by post-colonial thinkers or global area thinkers, which can still be explored. That's all.
Well, there are. I mean, this book tries its best. It's 464 pages. Tries to cover all the key ideas. There is no book which is going to be totally comprehensive, right? I don't even say how the constraints imposed by number of pages, publishers, and marketability. This is a trade book, so they don't want to. This is already well beyond the limit I was given. So if I had time to write another book, a follow-up book, or expand it, somebody gave me 800 pages, I will look at South Pacific. That's one region I missed. And when I went to New Zealand, my family for 3 weeks, where Manjeet is actually working. He's my former student, and we thought South Pacific deserves a lot more emphasis. We did not give that. I would everything I have in the book. We have reduced it from what. So I could probably talk more about Russia and Central Asia. Okay, so that's also kind of not getting enough attention. Uh, but I think within the page limits, the word limits, we've done as far as you can go. But I welcome suggestions like this. If you have specific suggestions, hey, you should have done this, should have done that. Like India, South India is not very well represented. But a lot of India is about North India. So those are valid gaps in the book. Thank you. Okay. Then we have to go and have your team come, and then we read. You can keep your questions for the end.